If you're a Red Dead fan, then just like me, you can't stop thinking of the next game in the franchise. Although some believe that the redemption arc of the Red Dead franchise is concluded, I believe that there is still space for another installment covering both the beginning and the end of the story. I believe the best way to have the third and final game in the Redemption series play out is by changing the view of redemption. Instead of having a man change his ways and save himself from sin, we have a character who throughout the game becomes forsaken as his good qualities chip away bit by bit, by the end leaving him as a monster. This character wouldn't be a new character to the franchise, but one we already know as players. His name is Dutch van der Linde. It will entail a young 21-year-old Dutch van der Linde after his father's death in the American Civil War. In the prologue, we will mostly learn about Dutch's past and his inner quarrels, and him surviving. We'll learn about the game mechanics. It will be a short part to introduce the player to the game, and will end with Dutch meeting Jose at a campfire on the way to Chicago, where they famously try to rob each other. This chapter will take place in different towns as Jose and Dutch start their 2-decade-long collaboration. It'll be a promising and fun start to the story of Dutch van der Linde, which will then make his crumble and descent into madness even more dreadful. Many of the stories of which Dutch and Jose talked about in Red Dead Redemption 2 will be shown in this chapter, like when they found themselves in Kettering, Ohio, and posed as international merchants to con locals into investing $300 into a made-up Portuguese shipping company. Eventually, they will be caught by Sheriff Carmichael, but then make their daring escape, robbing and tying up the sheriff in the process, which would end off the first chapter with a bounty being put on their head, making them wanted men for the first time. The chapter will bring in a whole new cast of characters who we are very familiar with from Red Dead Redemption 2, like Arthur Morgan, who's taken in by Dutch in 1877 and becomes their first protege. We see Dutch becoming a mentor to Arthur, and how different Arthur was compared to how we find him in Red Dead Redemption 2. Dutch around this time would also meet Susan Grimshaw, who he becomes romantically involved with, becoming a member of the gang herself. He, however, ends the relationship as he falls head over heels in love with Annabelle, who we hear about briefly in Red Dead Redemption 2. The chapter is set over the early years of the gang, where we will finally see the peak of the Wild West, which so many wish to see. The gang this time is drastically different, with them helping out the less fortunate and Dutch trying to be a Robin Hood sort of figure. Bessie, who is Jose's partner, also has a presence in this chapter, leading Jose to leave the gang for some time to settle with her, which changes the dynamic of the gang significantly. With Jose away, Dutch becomes the sole leader, and we see the relationship of Dutch and Arthur strengthen and the gang grow with more members joining. When Jose returns to the gang after losing Bessie, Dutch has now taken his place as the boss of the gang, showing the revelation of Dutch enjoying his role of leadership and seeing glimpses of his narcissism and vanity. Chapter 3 would be when John Marston joins the gang as a kid. Dutch is at his happiest. We see Arthur and John become brothers as the gang is in its full force. This takes place over the longest time period. Along the line, Colm O'Driscoll is introduced as the rivalry between his and Dutch's gang starts. Abigail also gets introduced, and we see John at his worst. He's uncaring and flinches from responsibility. We also see Arthur suffering from the pain after losing Eliza and Isaac. He goes into a period of self-loathing and him retreating from the world. As the relationship worsens between John and Arthur, we see a glimpse into Dutch's psyche, with Colm O'Driscoll's brother being killed by Dutch. Colm kills Annabelle, and we see Dutch dip to a new low. He meets Molly, charms and convinces her to follow him. And there ends chapter 3. This chapter takes place in West Elizabeth. We see the gang descend from the mountains into Blackwater. We see as Dutch takes on Charles and Micah and other gang members. We see the events as they take place right before Red Dead Redemption 2. We get a view of the gang right before it all crumbles and falls. As Dutch, we take part in being the center of all the commotion, especially when the Blackwater Massacre starts. We get a very big time skip, seeing Dutch broken. Bill and Javier is all that's left. Everyone else either dead or left him. They're all he has, and he doesn't even want them. We follow Dutch alone as he travels into the wilderness, away from civilization and away from people. We see him struggling with his mental state and his physical one, without anyone and without a purpose. He has lost everything, but is it at his own fault? Chapter 6 takes another time skip. We see Dutch a few days after Micah's death. He finds himself alone once more, not satisfied like he hoped he would be. Eventually he meets natives, their homes lost, their communities, their families, just angry young men that want revenge. Dutch sees this and takes advantage of this, falling back into the leader role, seeing men who could follow him like before. This is his most violent era, contrasting the beginning of the game. He no longer helps the poor, nor does he care who his crimes hurt. He doesn't even care to convince himself that he cares for his new purpose. He just wants to desperately evade order. He turns the natives into outlaws, forming an army almost from broken men, all for his own sake. Barely anything is left of who he once was or his ideals, just a ghost. This is all he has left. Surrounded by people but none of them family, clarity dawns on him as he knows he's too far gone. The gang loads up for another job and the game ends, not with his redemption, but the opposite, his fall.